They say Rowan Mercer has a heart of stone, that no woman, rich or beautiful, could move him. But one stormy afternoon, a quiet girl placed in his hand the only thing he had been searching for 5 years, and the valley was never the same. If you believe honesty still exists in the wild frontier, hit like, comment your city name below so I know how far this story has come. And don't leave, because what happens next will change everything. The morning Rowan Mercer buried what was left of his father, the sky above Caldwell Flats was the color of a bruise, quite purple and sick and low, pressing down on the valley like it had something to say and no patience left to say it politely. He didn't cry. People noticed that. Some thought it was strength, some thought it was grief so deep it had gone past tears into something harder, the way a river freezes not at the top but from the bottom up, locking everything solid where no one can see it. His cousin Delia, who had ridden 2 days to be there, tried to put her hand on his shoulder, and he stepped away from it without meaning to. It was just reflex by then. He was 29 years old, and he had nobody left. His father, Edmund Mercer, had been a difficult man by most accounts. Stubborn, quiet in the wrong moments, and loud in worse ones, prone to disappearing for weeks at a time into the high country, with nothing but a mule and a tin cup, and that brass compass he never went anywhere without. But he was honest in a way that most men in Caldwell Flats had stopped pretending to be, and that honesty had cost him. Rowan knew that much. He just didn't know yet what it had cost him, or who had made him pay it. What he knew was this. His father had gone up to the North Ridge on a Tuesday in October alone to survey the old water channels that fed the Mercer land. He had taken the compass. He had not come back. They found him 3 days later at the base of a rock formation called Widow's Ledge, lying face down in the creek bed with his skull caved in on one side and his saddlebags cut open and emptied. The compass was gone. The sheriff, a barrel-chested man named Holt Baines, who owed more than a few favors to the Callaway Ranch Syndicate, ruled it an accident. Said Edmund must have lost his footing on the wet rock. Said the saddlebags must have burst open in the fall and the contents scattered down the creek. Nobody who knew that ridge believed it. The creek wasn't deep enough to scatter anything. Edmund Mercer had been climbing that country since he was 12 years old. And men who fall from ledges don't end up with their bags cut clean. But Holt Baines had a family and a mortgage and certain arrangements with certain people, and so the verdict stood, and Edmund Mercer went into the ground a week before the first hard frost, and Rowan inherited the ranch and the debt and the silence and nothing else. 5 years passed. By the time the widows started coming, Rowan had rebuilt the Mercer Ranch from the edge of failure into something solid, if not exactly thriving. He had 40 head of cattle and a small horse operation that he ran with 2 hired hands, a wiry old man named Silas, who talked to the horses in Spanish even though neither he nor the horses spoke it, and a young Crow man named Thomas Bear who had drifted through the valley 3 years back and never left, possibly because Rowan paid him honestly and didn't treat him like furniture. The ranch sat on the western slope of the valley, fed by a thin creek that ran off snowmelt and hadn't gone completely dry even in the worst drought years, which made it more valuable than its size suggested. The house was plain, 2 rooms downstairs, 1 up, a porch that leaned slightly south like it was trying to get a better look at the valley below. Rowan had meant to fix the porch for 4 years. He hadn't. He was not by any measure the most eligible man in Caldwell Flats. There were richer ranchers, younger men who could dance at the harvest socials without looking like they were calculating the fastest route to the door. Rowan was 34 now, lean and windburned, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that looked like they'd been through a few arguments with barbed wire. He wasn't unfriendly exactly. He'd just stopped seeing the point in pretending things were easier than they were. And yet the widows came. The first was Mabel Trout, who had outlasted 2 husbands of moderate prosperity and arrived at Rowan's door in the spring with a peach cobbler and a great deal of cheerful noise about what a shame it was that a man as capable as Rowan Mercer had no woman to look after him. She stayed for 40 minutes. Rowan ate 1 piece of cobbler, thanked her, and went back to mending a fence line. She did not return. The second was Clara Voss, who was smarter and more direct and said straight out over coffee that she had land south of the valley and he had water rights north of it, and surely they were both sensible enough to see that was a more solid foundation for a marriage than most people started with. Rowan told her he appreciated the honesty. He told her no. She called him pig-headed on her way out, which was the most accurate thing anyone said to him that year. After Clara came a slow parade of others, some with money, some with property, some just lonely and looking for someone to be lonely with who at least owned good land. Each time Rowan was polite in the blunt way that was the only way he knew how to be polite, and each time the answer was no. The town had opinions about this. The town always had opinions. At the general store, run by a man named Earl Pickett, who wore the same canvas apron every day of his life, the prevailing theory was that Rowan Mercer had gone strange from living alone too long and couldn't be reached by normal means anymore. At the saloon, the theory was simpler, that Rowan was holding out for the compass, as if finding it would fix something that couldn't be fixed, and until it turned up, he wasn't going to let himself be properly alive. That theory, Rowan would have admitted, was closer to the truth, though he wouldn't have admitted it to anyone in that saloon. He had looked for the compass every way he could think of. He'd asked around quietly, written letters to trading posts in 3 directions, ridden up to Widow's Ledge a dozen times in 5 years to walk the creek bed. Nothing. Whatever had happened to it after his father's death, it had disappeared completely, swallowed up by the valley, or taken somewhere he couldn't reach. And it mattered in a way that was hard to explain to people who hadn't known Edmund Mercer. The compass wasn't expensive. It wasn't particularly beautiful. It was a battered brass thing about the size of a man's palm, with a cracked crystal and an engraving on the back that Rowan had never been able to read clearly because the metal was worn smooth in places. His father had carried it every single day for 30 years. He'd used it to find his way home through 6 blizzards, to navigate surveys nobody else would take on, to teach Rowan how to read the land by reading the sky. Losing it felt like losing the last honest piece of him. The morning Eliza Wren arrived was a Thursday in November, which was not a day that announced itself as significant. It was cold and gray, with a wind coming off the high country that smelled like iron and coming snow. Rowan had been up since before light, dealing with a yearling heifer that had gotten her leg tangled in wire overnight and needed tending before she pulled something permanent. By the time he got her free and cleaned the cut and got back to the barn, his hands were stiff and his temper was shorter than usual, which was saying something. He heard the gate creak. He stepped out of the barn to find a woman standing at the edge of his yard, or stopping herself from stepping further in. More precisely, like she'd walked to the gate and then reconsidered whether she had the right to come through it. She was young, maybe 24 or 25, with dark hair pulled back plain and a coat that had seen better winters. She was holding something in both hands, and she wasn't looking at the house. She was looking at the ground, like she was running through what she'd planned to say, and wasn't sure she had it right. Rowan crossed the yard toward her. "Can I help you?" She looked up. She had steady gray eyes and a smudge of something dark on her left cheekbone. Coal dust, he'd later learn, from her work at the Pickett store where she sorted freight on the loading dock. She didn't smile automatically the way people sometimes did when they were about to ask him for something. She just looked at him directly, and then she held out what she was carrying. It was the compass. He stopped walking. It sat in her palm, battered brass with the cracked crystal face, the chain wrapped twice around her fingers so it wouldn't swing. He knew every scratch on it. He'd spent 5 years trying to remember if there was 1 mark or 2 on the lower rim, and now he could see there were 2, and he knew he was right. "Where did you get that?" he said. It came out flat, not quite a question. "My uncle had it," she said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "He passed in the spring. I was going through his things, and I found it wrapped in cloth in the bottom of a trunk. There was a name scratched on the back." She turned the compass over and held it out further. "Edmund Mercer. I asked around about who that was." Rowan walked forward and took it out of her hand. He turned it over himself. The name was there, faint but legible, scratched in his father's angular handwriting. The kind of marking a man made when he wanted something found if it got lost. He'd never known his father had done that. He stood there for a moment, just holding it. The weight was right. The way the crystal shifted in the case when you tilted it was exactly right. "Your uncle," he said. "What was his name?" "Danner. Roy Danner. He worked freight routes between here and the Halder Basin for a long time." She paused. "I don't know how he came to have it. I don't know if he found it somewhere or—" She stopped. "I don't know. I just knew it wasn't his and it wasn't right to keep it. Rowan looked at her. Most people would have sold it. It's not mine to sell. He didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for him because usually silence came easy. He searched her face for the angle because there was always an angle. Someone sending her to soften him up, maybe. Someone wanting him to feel grateful enough to invite her in and start asking questions about the land or the water rights or whatever else people wanted from the Mercer property. She didn't look like that. She looked like a woman who'd walked a few miles in cold weather to return something that wasn't hers and was now ready to leave. Is there anything? He started. No, she said. Just that. Then she turned and walked back through the gate, pulling her coat tighter against the wind. She went down the road without looking back, her boots cutting clean marks in the frost-hard mud, and Rowan stood at the edge of his yard holding his dead father's compass and watching her go. He didn't go after her. He didn't even call out. He just watched her disappear around the bend in the road, and then he stood there for another minute in the cold, and something he hadn't felt in a long time moved through him, like a word he'd forgotten how to pronounce. He asked about her the next day. Earl Pickett confirmed she worked at his store, had done for about 8 months since moving to Caldwell Flats from somewhere southeast of the Halder Basin. Came with her uncle. Rowan's chest tightened at that. And after Roy Danner died, she'd stayed on because she had nowhere better to go, and the work was steady. She was quiet, Pickett said. Did her job without complaining and without trying to make herself more interesting than she was, which he seemed to find refreshing. Doesn't gossip, Pickett said, which in his voice sounded like the highest form of praise. She got family? Rowan asked. Not that she talks about. Pickett pulled his apron strings tighter. Why? You finally taking applications, Mercer? Rowan bought a bag of oats and left. He spent that evening on the porch, the leaning one, turning the compass over in his hands the way he had 100 times in memory and could now do in fact. He studied the back of it properly for the first time. His father's name. And below it, just barely visible in the worn brass, a series of marks he hadn't noticed in the original. They might have been decorative. They might have been wear patterns from a pocket or a belt loop. He tilted the compass toward the lamplight coming through the window. They weren't decorative. He sat forward in his chair. The marks were deliberate, small, careful, precise. Not words, but a series of lines and angles and numbers. So faint you'd never see them unless you were looking, or unless you held the metal at exactly the right angle to the light. His father's handwriting appeared in the name, but these marks were different, older looking somehow. Like they'd been made slowly and carefully over a long period of time, a little at a time, the way a man might add to something when he had something new to say and didn't trust paper to keep the secret. Rowan sat back. The wind was picking up, pushing against the south side of the porch, hard enough to make the boards groan. He closed his hand around the compass. Roy Danner had worked freight routes between Caldwell Flats and the Halder Basin. If he'd had the compass since Edmund's death, if he'd been the one carrying it all this time, wrapped in cloth at the bottom of a trunk, then he'd had it long enough that taking it hadn't been accidental. A man didn't find a thing in a creek bed and wrap it up carefully and hide it in a trunk unless the thing meant something to him, or unless someone had told him to hold on to it and keep quiet. Which meant either Roy Danner had known something about Edmund Mercer's death, or he'd been paid to make the compass disappear, or, and this one sat in Rowan's chest like a coal starting to heat, he'd been trying to protect it, holding it safe until he could figure out who to give it to or what to do with what was inside it. And then Roy Danner had died in the spring, and his niece had found it, and she'd brought it here. Rowan looked up at the dark shape of the mountains against the darker sky. He needed to talk to Eliza Wren. He went to the store 2 days later, which cost him something, because the store was the center of every conversation that had ever happened in Caldwell Flats, and walking in there to speak to the freight girl was going to get noticed and commented on by every soul within earshot. He went anyway because putting it off felt like something he'd regret. She was on the loading dock out back, moving crates of dry goods from a delivery wagon into the storeroom. She was smaller than he'd remembered in some ways and more solid in others. The kind of person who looked like they'd simply made a decision at some point to be capable, and had acted on it consistently ever since. She saw him coming and stopped what she was doing, but she didn't look alarmed. She looked like someone who had expected him to come back eventually and had decided to wait until he did. "Miss Wren," he said. "Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you something about your uncle." She set down the crate she was holding. "All right. How long had he been carrying the compass? As far as you know." She thought about it honestly. He could see her thinking, not performing the appearance of thinking. "At least 4 years. Maybe longer. I've only known him that well for 4 years, since I came to stay with him after my mother passed. I never saw him open the trunk, but I knew the trunk was there and that he was particular about it." "He never mentioned Edmund Mercer." "No." She paused. "He didn't talk much about his freight work once he stopped doing it. He got sick about 18 months before he died. His lungs, and after that he mostly just sat and looked out the window." She looked at Rowan directly. "He did say one thing, about 2 weeks before the end. I don't even know if he meant for me to hear it. He said, 'Tell him the mountain keeps what the valley forgets.' I don't know who he meant. I don't know if it was the illness talking." Rowan went still. "The mountain keeps what the valley forgets." "Did he say anything else?" "That was it. He didn't bring it up again, and I didn't want to push him." She watched Rowan's face carefully. "Does that mean something to you?" "I don't know yet," he said, which was mostly true. "The markings on the back of the compass. The ones under my father's name. Did you notice them?" She nodded slowly. "I saw marks. I thought they were where." "They're not. Someone made them deliberately, a long time ago by the look of it." She was quiet for a moment. The wagon horse shuffled behind her and she glanced at it automatically, the way people do when they're used to being around working animals. Then she looked back at him. "What do you think they are?" "I think they might be a map," Rowan said, "or part of one." What happened over the following week was something Rowan hadn't expected and wasn't equipped to handle gracefully, which was the town deciding it had opinions about Eliza Wren and what she was after. He'd gone back to the dock twice more to talk with her, both times in broad daylight, with absolutely nothing secretive about it. He needed to understand what she knew about Roy Danner's routes, which passes he'd traveled, who he'd worked with. She answered what she could and said plainly when she didn't know something, which Rowan appreciated more than she probably realized because he was accustomed to people filling in what they didn't know with guesses they presented as facts. But twice in broad daylight was enough. By the time he rode into town on the third Thursday, the store was buzzing with something he could feel before he pushed through the door. Mabel Trout was there buying flour. Clara Voss was there for reasons that were less clear. 3 other women whose names he only half remembered were clustered near the dry goods shelves with the particular posture of people discussing something they'll stop discussing the moment you're close enough to hear. He heard it anyway, because Clara Voss had never seen much point in lowering her voice. Girl comes in with nothing, finds out he's still looking for that compass, waits for the right moment. "She worked freight with her uncle," said the woman next to her. "She probably found that compass years ago and just held on to it until she's after the water rights, is what she's after. Edmund Mercer's notes about the North Springs, whatever the old man—" "Ladies," Rowan said it from the doorway. The room made a variety of sounds and rearranged itself. Clara Voss had the dignity to look mildly embarrassed. Mabel Trout did not. "Rowan," Mabel said warmly, like she hadn't just been saying whatever she'd been saying. "You're looking thin. Are you eating properly?" "I eat fine," Rowan said. He looked at Clara. "The girl found the compass in her dead uncle's trunk and brought it back because it wasn't hers to keep. That's all there is to it." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Is that all there is to it?" "Yes." "Then why have you been out to the dock 3 times?" "Because I have questions about Roy Danner, and she's the only one who can answer them." He said it flat and clean, the way you said something when you meant it to close a conversation. "My father didn't fall off that ledge, Clara. You know that as well as anyone. And whatever was in that compass has something to do with why." The room got quiet in a different way. Clara's expression shifted, the social calculation sliding away for a moment, leaving something more genuine underneath. She'd known Edmund Mercer. Most of the older people in the room had. "Rowan," she said, and her voice was a register lower. "If that's true, if there's something in that compass worth knowing, then you be careful who you let know you're looking at it. I know. The Calloway people are not gentle when they feel threatened. I know that too." He bought what he'd come for and left. He couldn't decode the markings alone. He'd spent 3 evenings with them by lamplight and had gotten precisely nowhere. He could see they were deliberate, could see there was a pattern, but he didn't have the context to read them. They weren't standard survey notation, which he knew from the work his father had done. They were something else. Something personal, maybe. A system his father had invented for himself, knowing no one else would be able to read it without a key. Unless the key was in the compass itself, or in what Roy Danner had said. The mountain keeps what the valley forgets. He rode up to the North Ridge on a cold Sunday morning, not to find anything specific, but to think. He took the compass and held it while he sat on a flat rock and looked out over the valley. Below, Caldwell Flats spread out in its orderly mess. The main street, the church, the network of homesteads running south, and to the east the larger, meaner sprawl of the Callaway operation, and the 2 or 3 other big ranches that had been quietly buying up or squeezing out smaller parcels for 15 years. To the west, nothing but scrub and rock and the distant blue rise of the Ridgeback Mountains. His father had been surveying water channels the day he died. Rowan turned the compass over. The markings were there in the gray morning light, very faint. He traced one with his thumbnail without pressing. There were lines that could be elevation markers, numbers that could be distances, and in the lower left corner of the compass back, a grouping that he'd initially read as damage, but now, looking at it outside in natural light, looked like it might be a directional indicator. A bearing. He looked up at the mountains. If the markings were a map, or a set of directions, and they pointed into the high country northwest of Widow's Ledge, then what Roy Danner had said started to make a specific kind of sense. The mountain keeps what the valley forgets. What if Edmund Mercer had found something? A water source, a spring, a channel nobody else knew about, and had recorded it in the compass? What if that was why he'd been killed? The Callaway Syndicate controlled water in this valley the way certain men controlled everything they could get their hands on, not because they needed all of it, but because controlling it meant controlling the people who did. If there was a water source the valley could access independently, outside their control, then everything they'd built their power on started to look fragile. Rowan sat on his rock for a long time, working through it. Then he rode back to town. He found Eliza at the end of her workday, stepping off the dock into the cold, pulling on her gloves. The sky was going orange and purple to the west, which would have been pretty if Rowan had been in the mood to notice pretty things. "I need to show you something," he said. She looked at him steadily. Not suspicious, not eager. "All right." They sat on the tailgate of Earl Pickett's empty delivery wagon, Pickett having gone home an hour ago, and Rowan laid the compass between them in the fading light. He showed her the markings, tracing them lightly so she could see what he was pointing to. "I think there are 2 different sections," he said. "The upper ones. These, I think those might be elevation lines, like a terrain sketch, just compressed. And these here, this cluster," he pointed to the lower portion. "I think that's a bearing and a distance. Your uncle's route would have taken him through the northwest passes." She leaned in close enough that her shoulder almost touched his arm, looking at where he was pointing. She smelled like sawdust and cold air. He always took the Crow Fork Trail when he went northwest. It's the only reliable one in winter. "That trail runs past Widow's Ledge." "Yes." "My father was killed at Widow's Ledge." She looked up at him. She was close enough that he could see she was thinking through the same sequence he was. Roy Danner was on that route. He could have found the compass there, or been given it. "Or been paid to take it," Rowan said, and then couldn't bring himself to lose it entirely, so he kept it, thinking. "Tell him the mountain keeps what the valley forgets," she said quietly. He was trying to pass the message. He just ran out of time to pass it properly. They were both quiet for a moment. The wind pushed through the gap between the storeroom and the stable, carrying the smell of hay and cold. "If your father found a water source up there," Eliza said slowly, "and he was killed for it, then it's still there," Rowan said, "and the compass is the only record of where. And the people who killed your father don't know you have it back." "Not yet." She sat back slightly. "Mr. Mercer, what are you going to do?" He closed his hand around the compass. "I'm going to find what my father died trying to protect." He paused. and I'd like your help doing it. You know Danner's routes. You know the Northwest Passes better than I do, from what he must have told you." She looked at him for a long moment, not calculating, not flattered, just looking, the way she'd looked at him when she handed him the compass, like she was deciding something that mattered. "I'll think about it," she said. "Fair enough." She climbed down from the tailgate, landed steadily on both feet. "Mr. Mercer." "Rowan." She paused. "Rowan, you should know something. I'm not trying to get anything from you. I don't want the land or the water rights or whatever's at the end of wherever that compass points. I just want—" She stopped, like she was having trouble with the right word. "I want whatever your father found to matter. I don't know why. Maybe because Roy held on to it all that time for a reason, and I want that to mean something. Maybe because—" She stopped again. "I don't know. I'll think about it." She walked away down the alley, her boots quiet on the frozen ground. Rowan sat on the tailgate alone in the gathering dark, the compass warm in his palm from the heat of both their hands, and tried to remember the last time someone had said they wanted something for a reason that had nothing to do with him. He was still sitting there when the first stars came out, hard and bright and cold above the valley, and the mountains in the northwest went black against the sky like a wall hiding everything the valley had forgotten and the mountain had kept. He would find it. He would find all of it. But first he needed to know if the woman who'd walked away down that alley was going to walk back. He thought she might. She came back. Not the next morning, not even the morning after that. Rowan had spent 2 days telling himself it didn't matter either way, that he could figure out the compass markings on his own eventually, that he didn't need anyone's help, and certainly not a woman he'd known for the span of 3 brief conversations in cold weather. He'd spent those 2 days being thoroughly unconvincing to himself. On the 3rd morning, she knocked on his door before sunrise, which was either a good sign or a sign that she'd decided to tell him in person that she'd thought about it, and the answer was no. She was wearing the same coat as before and carrying a canvas satchel over one shoulder. She looked like someone who had packed. "I remembered something," she said, by way of greeting. "Roy had a notebook. He kept records of his routes, not the official freight records. Those went to whoever hired him. His own notebook. I didn't think much of it when I found it because I couldn't make sense of what was in it. But if what you said about the compass markings is right—" She reached into the satchel and produced a small battered notebook with a cover that had been repaired twice with different colors of leather cord. She held it out. Rowan took it. He opened it at random. Roy Danner's handwriting was cramped and irregular, the writing of a man who'd spent his life doing things with his hands rather than a pen. There were route notations, weather observations, complaints about mules, and then, starting about 2/3 of the way through, a series of entries that stopped being about freight entirely. Numbers, bearings, sketches of terrain that didn't match any route Rowan recognized. "When did he start writing like this?" Rowan asked. "I checked the dates. About 5 years ago." She paused just long enough for that to settle. Right around when he would have come into possession of the compass. Rowan stood in his doorway with the notebook in one hand and the compass in the other, and the weight of what that meant pressed down on him steady and specific. Roy Danner hadn't just been holding the compass, he'd been working on it, trying to read the same markings Rowan had spent 3 nights staring at, and leaving his attempts in a notebook he'd apparently never shown another living person. "Come in," Rowan said. "I'll make coffee." It was bad coffee. He knew that before she finished the first cup and said nothing about it, which he appreciated. He spread the notebook open on the kitchen table next to the compass, and they bent over both of them in the early gray light coming through the window while the stove ticked behind them. The notebook made the compass start to speak. Roy Danner had been working from the same premise Rowan had arrived at independently, that the markings were a compressed set of directions rather than a single map. He'd made several attempts to plot them out, crossing each one out with heavy lines when it didn't resolve into anything usable. But in the last 3 pages of entries, his handwriting changed. It slowed down. The crossings out stopped. The numbers took on a different arrangement, and underneath a final set of calculations was a notation in a different ink than the rest, written more carefully than anything else on the page. Northwest of the Crow Fork Cutoff, past the second snowfield, Stone Gate. Below that, 3 words were underlined twice: original headwater source. Rowan put the notebook down slowly. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind working at the north corner of the house. "Do you know what this means?" Eliza said. She wasn't asking it dramatically. She was asking it the way she said everything, straight, because she wanted to understand. "The valley's water," he tapped the notation. "The ranches, the Callaway operation, the Aldridge claim, all the big ones. They've controlled the water rights in this valley for 20 years. They own the diversion channels, they own the allocation agreements, they charge what they want and cut off what they want. Every smaller homesteader in this valley is at their mercy." He looked up. "But the water they're controlling, it's not the original source. It's diverted, managed. The original headwater spring, the one the whole system flows from, nobody's been able to locate it for 30 years. It's somewhere up in the high northwest country, and without finding it, nobody can challenge the syndicate's claim on the water at all. They own the infrastructure, not the source. Because nobody knew where the source was." "Edmund Mercer knew," Rowan said, "or found out, and went up there to verify it and record it properly so the information couldn't be disputed." He picked up the compass again. "And somebody found out he knew and made sure he didn't come back with it." The silence that followed that had teeth. Eliza wrapped both hands around her cup. "Roy knew too then, at least the outline of it. He knew enough to be scared of it, otherwise he'd have come forward." Rowan turned the compass over. He was protecting it, waiting. Maybe waiting for someone with the weight to do something with it that wouldn't just get them killed like my father got killed. And instead he died of bad lungs in a rented room. "Yes." She looked out the window at the dark shape of the mountains, and Rowan looked at her and thought that she was doing something difficult in that moment. Working something through that wasn't about the compass or the water or the syndicate at all. Something more personal, about what it meant to carry something for a person who'd kept you at arm's length and never explained why. "He wasn't trying to hide it from you," Rowan said. He didn't know if it was true, but it felt true, and she seemed like someone who deserved the benefit of that. She nodded once, not looking away from the window. "I know." A beat. "I think he was scared. He was a careful man. Too careful sometimes. He would have thought through every version of what could go wrong." She turned back to the table. "He probably thought I was safer not knowing." He was probably right. He was wrong, she said, flat and certain. Being kept safe from something isn't the same as being safe. You're just surprised when it catches up to you. She pulled the notebook closer and looked at Roy's final entry again. "What do we do?" Rowan had been thinking about that since he opened the notebook. The path forward was clear in its direction and deeply unpleasant in its details. Going up into the northwest high country in November was not something a sensible person planned casually. The weather in the Ridgeback Range past the Crow Fork cutoff could turn inside of 2 hours, and turning wrong up there was a different order of problem than turning wrong down here, and that was before accounting for the fact that certain people in this valley would very much prefer that the headwater source remain unfound. "We go up there and verify it," he said. "Find the spring. And if the documents my father made are still there, because if he was recording it properly, there would have been survey documents, measurements, something legal, then we bring them back." "If," she said. "If," he agreed. "And if someone finds out we're going, then we move before they do." She looked at him the same way she had on the tailgate of the delivery wagon, assessing, not performing. He got the impression she was deciding whether he was the kind of man who meant what he said about moving fast, or the kind who said it and then spent a week preparing and gave the other party time to react. "When?" she said. 3 days. I need to square away the ranch and get provisions." He paused. "You don't have to come. You've already done more than anyone could have asked." "I know Roy's route. You don't." She said it without heat, just accurately. "You'd lose a day at least trying to find the Crow Fork cutoff in winter conditions, and you might not find it at all. I've ridden that trail with him twice. I know where the markers are." He thought about pointing out that riding the trail twice in summer or fall was different from riding it in November. He thought she probably already knew that. All right, she said. She picked up her satchel from the floor. 3 days. She left, and Silas came in from the barn 20 minutes later, took one look at the notebook and compass spread across the kitchen table, poured himself the bad coffee, and said nothing at all, which was one of his better qualities. The town found out before the 3 days were up. Not the details, not the compass or Roy Danner's notebook or the Headwater Spring, but the general shape of it. That Rowan Mercer had been to see Eliza Wren multiple times, that she'd been to his ranch, that preparations of some undetermined kind were underway. Small towns ran on less fuel than that. Rowan was at Earl Pickett's buying rope and hard tack on the afternoon of the second day when he heard his name spoken in a register that wasn't conversational. He recognized the voice before he turned around. Preston Calloway, the oldest son of the Calloway operation, and the face the syndicate liked to put in public, because he had the kind of easy manner that made people forget they were being managed. Preston was 40, broad through the shoulders, with a smile that arrived half a second after his eyes needed it to. He crossed the store toward Rowan with his hand extended, like they were running into each other at a social, rather than like Preston had watched him walk into the store from across the street and followed him in. Rowan. Handshake. Firm. Calibrated. Haven't seen you in a while. How are the cattle? Fine. Winter coming on early this year. Preston glanced at the rope Rowan was holding. Preparing for something? Always something to fix, Rowan said. Preston smiled, waited to see if Rowan would fill the silence. Rowan didn't. I hear you've been spending some time with the Danner girl. Wren, Rowan said. Her name's Wren. Right. Danner was her uncle. Sad thing, him passing. Preston picked up a small item from a nearby shelf, looked at it, set it down with the ease of a man who'd never had to think about what things cost. You know, Roy Danner worked freight routes for my family back some years. Good man, reliable. He let that sit for a moment. Did you know him at all before he passed? No, Rowan said, which was true. Strange business, losing track of people like that. You'd know someone for years and then one day they're just... Preston snapped his fingers lightly. Gone. And whatever they knew goes with them. He looked at Rowan directly now, the smile still present, but doing less work than it usually did. You've been doing all right, Rowan? Since your father passed? We never talked enough about that, I always thought. I've been fine. Right, well, Preston took a step back, the conversation closing itself in the way that conversations closed when they delivered what they came to deliver. You take care of yourself out there. Weather like this, a man goes up into the high country, and things can go sideways fast. He paused, hand on the doorframe. You're not planning anything like that, I hope. Rowan looked at him. I'm buying rope and hardtack, Preston. Of course. The smile hit its mark this time, comfortable and practiced. Good to see you. He left. Rowan stood in the store with the rope in his hand and the absolute certainty that they had 2 days at most before someone with Calloway money was watching the road north. He found Eliza that evening and told her 1 day, not 3. She looked at him and said, I'll be ready at first light. The hardest conversation was with Silas, not because Silas would object, but because leaving the ranch in winter with no specific return date and asking a 60-year-old man and a 23-year-old to manage it was the kind of thing that could go wrong in directions Rowan couldn't anticipate and couldn't fix from 2 mountain passes away. He sat Silas and Thomas Bear down at the kitchen table and told them straight where he was going, roughly, and why he was going, also roughly, leaving out the specific details of the spring location, because the less they knew, the less they could be pressured to give. Thomas Bear listened to all of it without expression, and then said, The Calloway people are going to be unpleasant about this. Probably. More unpleasant than usual. Probably. Thomas nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd thought for years. You trust this woman? The one who brought the compass? I don't have a reason not to. That's not the same as trusting her. Rowan thought about it honestly. Yes, he said, I trust her. Thomas Bear nodded again. All right. Silas, for his part, said he'd keep the cattle fed and the ranch quiet, and that if anyone came around asking questions, he'd tell them Rowan had gone south to look at breeding stock, which was a reasonable lie because Rowan had mentioned doing exactly that several months ago, and Silas had a good memory for the kind of truths that made good cover. "You'll be careful," Silas said. Not a question. "I'll try." "Try harder than usual. The high country in November doesn't care how careful you are, but it goes better if you try." Rowan told him he knew. He went to bed that night without sleeping much, lying on his back in the dark with the compass on the table beside him, and the sense of something old and unfinished finally beginning to move, like a wheel that's been frozen all winter just starting to turn. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't clean, but it felt like the first true thing he'd done in 5 years, and that was worth something. He fell asleep somewhere close to 2 in the morning. By 4 he was awake and moving. By the time the sky showed the first thin gray line of dawn above the eastern ridge, Rowan Mercer and Eliza Wren rode out of Caldwell Flats on the northern road with their horses carrying enough for 2 weeks and the compass wrapped in Rowan's coat pocket, warm against his chest. Nobody saw them leave. That was the intention. Whether it worked was something they wouldn't know until much later, when knowing it would either be a relief or something considerably worse. The mountains rose ahead of them, gray and cold and indifferent, keeping what the valley had forgotten, the way mountains do. The first day's ride was hard, and the second was harder. The Crow Fork Trail climbed steadily from the valley floor through scrub pine and loose shale, narrowing as it gained elevation until in places it was barely wide enough for a horse to move without the rider pulling their leg in tight against the rock face. Eliza rode ahead because she knew the markers. A particular notch cut into a boulder at the first fork. A cairn Roy Danner had built himself at the second, and that had survived intact. She didn't perform her knowledge of the route. She just used it, quietly and practically, which was consistent with everything else about her. Rowan watched her navigate and thought about how Roy Danner had ridden this same trail knowing what he knew, and keeping it sealed inside himself like something too dangerous to set down. He thought about what that kind of silence cost a person over years. He thought about his father. He stopped thinking about his father when his horse hit a patch of ice under fresh snow and went sideways 2 feet before catching herself, and after that he concentrated on the trail. They camped the first night in a shallow overhang of rock that cut the wind on 3 sides, eating cold hardtack and dried meat, because building a fire at elevation in November was advertising your position in a way neither of them wanted to do. Eliza didn't complain about the cold food. She didn't complain about the cold either, which was real and specific, and the kind that settled into your joints by evening and made everything slightly harder than it should have been. "How far to the Crow Fork cut off?" Rowan asked. "Half a day tomorrow. Maybe more if the second snowfield is deeper than it was last time I came through." She pulled her coat tighter. "When Roy and I came in October 2 years ago, you could still read the ground under the snow. November is different." "You rode this in October with him. He never said why?" She was quiet for a moment. "He said he was checking on something for a friend. I didn't ask more than that. Roy didn't like being pushed." She shifted against the rock. "I thought the friend was a woman. Honestly. He was cagey in a way that felt personal. Now I think he was trying to find the stone gate on his own before he was ready to tell anyone else about it." "Did he?" "I don't know. He never said." She looked at the dark overhang above them. "I think he found the approach and got scared and turned back. That was Roy's way. He'd get close to a thing and then decide he needed more time to think about it." A short pause. "He always thought there was more time." Rowan didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. He took first watch and sat at the edge of the overhang, listening to the wind work through the pass below them, big and purposeful. The kind of wind that reminded you that the mountains had been here longer than anything you could name and would be here after everything you built was gone. The compass was in his chest pocket. He touched it through the coat once, just to confirm it was still there, and then put his hand back in his lap and watched the dark. Nothing moved. That didn't mean nothing was there. Sub. The second snowfield was deeper than Eliza had seen it, knee-high on the horses in the center with a crust that broke wrong, firm enough to feel trustworthy, soft enough underneath to swallow a hoof and wrench something if the animal stepped badly. They moved through it single file and slow, Eliza reading the surface the way her uncle had apparently taught her, probing with a stick before each stretch, talking to her mare in a low, steady voice that the horse seemed to actually respond to. It took 3 hours to cross what should have taken 40 minutes. By the time they reached the rock shelf on the far side, both horses were blowing hard, and Rowan's back teeth ached from clenching against the cold. "There," Eliza said. The cutoff was a narrow cleft in the rock face that didn't look like anything from the approach. Just a shadow, a fold in the stone that could have been a crack or a deer trail or nothing at all. But when they got close enough, the cleft opened into a passage wide enough for the horses, and beyond it the terrain changed completely. The wind dropped. The snow thinned. The rock on either side was darker, volcanic, and below their feet a thin trickle of water ran over smooth stone even in this cold. Running water. Above the snowfield, above the frost line, in November. Rowan climbed down and crouched beside it. The water was clear and cold and fast, coming from somewhere above, cutting through a channel that the rock had shaped over so long a time that the edges were worn silk smooth. He put his hand in it. It was the kind of cold that was almost on the other side of cold. Pure and shocking, and under the right circumstances, probably the most valuable thing in 50 miles. He looked up at Eliza. She was watching him from horseback with an expression that wasn't triumph exactly, more like recognition, like she'd suspected something and was now watching it confirm itself. "Roy found this," she said. It wasn't a question. "Your uncle and my father," Rowan said. He stood up and dried his hand on his coat. Maybe separately, maybe together. Either way, they both knew. He looked up the channel to where it curved out of sight around a bend in the rock. The stone gate should be above. They followed the water up, but the gate was not what Rowan had pictured from Roy's description. He'd imagined something constructed, something man-made. What they found was a natural formation, 2 columns of dark rock rising on either side of the channel with a flat stone across the top, forming an arch that was just regular enough to look intentional and just irregular enough to have been made by nothing but time and pressure and water. Beneath the arch, the channel widened into a shallow basin, and above the basin, from a crack in the rock face about 8 feet up, the spring emerged. Not a trickle, a real flow, steady and clear, pushing out of the mountain with the quiet insistence of something that had been doing exactly this for longer than anyone alive could account for. Edmund Mercer's survey markers were on the right column of the arch. Not obvious unless you were looking. Small notches in the rock at measured intervals. The notation system his father had used all his professional life. Rowan recognized them immediately and had to stop for a moment because recognition of that kind, when you haven't expected it, hits somewhere behind the sternum and doesn't move fast. He pressed his fingers against the notches. His father's hands had made these marks. His father had stood in this exact spot, in this passage, and measured and recorded and known that what he'd found would change everything for every small homesteader in the valley below. And then he had ridden home, and someone had been waiting. "There are documents," Rowan said, steadier than he felt. If he followed his own procedure, there are documents. He would have stored them somewhere weatherproof. He looked around the basin. The rock face on the left side of the arch had a natural shelf, recessed enough to be sheltered from direct snow and rain. He went to it. It took him a few minutes of feeling along the shelf. His fingers were clumsy with cold and the light was poor inside the passage. But he found it. A flat tin case, the kind surveyors used for field documents, wedged into a crack in the shelf with a piece of oilcloth wrapped around it. The tin was corroded on the outside and the latch was stiff. He worked it open. Inside, dry and intact, survey documents in his father's handwriting, folded close, covering measurements of the spring output, the channel course, the water volume estimates. And beneath those, something else. Pages that weren't survey notation, they were correspondence. Letters, copied in his father's hand, between people whose names Rowan recognized. Names from the valley, names connected to the Callaway Syndicate, connected to the water allocation agreements, connected to the arrangement that had kept small homesteaders in a condition of permanent, managed dependence for 2 decades. His father had been collecting evidence, not just finding the spring, investigating the fraud built around hiding it. The survey was proof the source existed. The letters were proof the source had been deliberately concealed and the water rights constructed on top of that concealment. Rowan stood in the cold basin holding his dead father's work in both hands, and the anger that moved through him was not hot. It was cold and specific and very, very clear. "We need to move," Eliza said from behind him. He turned. She was looking back the way they'd come, through the cleft in the rock, her head tilted in the particular way of a person who has heard something and is deciding whether it was the wind. It was not the wind. The horses heard it next, both of them lifting their heads, ears forward, pointing toward the snowfield side of the passage. Then Rowan heard it himself, boot steps on rock, more than one person, moving with the deliberate quiet of people who knew they were in earshot. He folded the documents back into the tin and shoved the tin inside his coat. He looked at Eliza and she was already moving toward her horse, reaching for the saddlebag where she'd packed the rifle. She didn't get there. 3 men came through the cleft in a tight group, moving fast now that they'd been heard, and the first one through had his gun already drawn and pointed. Rowan recognized 2 of the 3, ranch hands who worked the Callaway operation, men he'd seen in town 100 times without looking at them particularly. The third he didn't know. But the man behind all of them, stepping through the cleft last, unhurried, wearing a good coat and a particular expression, was someone Rowan had known since he was 12 years old. Cole Maddox. Cole had been his father's foreman for 9 years. He'd been on the Mercer property since before Rowan could form clear memories, a constant background presence, capable, steady, the kind of man Edmund Mercer had trusted to run the operation when he was away on surveys. After Edmund's death, Cole had left the Mercer ranch within a week, citing his own plans, and Rowan had been too deep in grief to examine that timing. He'd thought about it later, but Cole had gone east and the trail had gone with him. He was here now, standing in the passage above the headwater spring, looking at Rowan the way a man looks at someone he has genuinely complicated feelings about. "Rowan," Cole said. His voice was the same, low, measured, careful. "I'm sorry it came to this." Rowan heard himself say, "How long?" and his own voice sounded far away. "How long have I been working for them?" Cole let out a slow breath. "Edmund hired me when I was 22. The Callaways approached me the second year. I needed the money. I had debts, serious ones, and they paid them. And then I was in it, and there wasn't a clear way out of it." He paused. "Your father didn't deserve what happened to him. I want you to know I didn't plan that." "But you knew it was going to happen." The pause before Cole answered was its own kind of answer. "I knew they were going to stop him. I didn't know how far they'd go until it was done." He shook his head. "By then it was done. You left the ranch in a week. I couldn't stay. Looking at you every day." He stopped. "I couldn't stay." One of the hired men stepped sideways, moving to get an angle on Eliza, and Rowan shifted automatically to track him, and Cole said, "Nobody's going to hurt her. Give me the tin and the compass, and we ride out. That's all. It doesn't have to be worse than this." "The documents prove what they did," Rowan said. "They prove why my father was killed." "The documents disappear and nobody can prove anything. You know how this works. You're not a child." Cole's voice was tired more than threatening, the weariness of a man who'd been carrying something ugly for a long time and had gotten used to the weight without getting comfortable with it. "They're not going to let this come out, Rowan. You've got to know that. You ride back to the valley with that tin and you'll be dead inside a week. Then I'll take that risk. I'm trying to keep you alive." "No," Rowan said. "You're trying to keep yourself out of a cell." Cole's jaw tightened. For a moment, something moved across his face that might have been shame, real shame, not the performed variety. And then it settled back into the tired, resolved expression. "Take the compass," he said to the man on his right, "and the tin." What happened next happened fast and badly. The man went for Rowan, and Rowan was ready for it, had been watching the man's feet for the weight shift that would come before the move. He got a hand on the man's gun arm and they went sideways together into the rock face, and the gun went off. The sound in the narrow passage was enormous, and the horses screamed and tried to bolt in a space too narrow to bolt in. In the chaos of that, Rowan lost track of Eliza. He got the gun away from the man and hit him twice, hard and practical. No art to it, just stopping power. He turned and the second hired man hit him from the side, and they went down together, and the rock shelf was uneven, and his knee found the worst part of it. He felt something tear, Not catastrophically, but enough. And when he got the second man off him and got to his feet, his left leg took his weight wrong. Cole had the tin. He'd gotten it out of Rowan's coat in the scramble, or the third man had, the one Rowan didn't know, and had passed it to Cole. Cole was backing toward the cleft with it. The compass had come loose in the struggle and was on the rock floor of the basin, its chain tangled. Rowan lurched toward it and the rock above him, disturbed by the gunshot, by 5 winters of freeze and thaw, waiting for exactly this kind of excuse, gave way. Not all of it. Enough. A section of the overhang above the left column of the arch broke free and came down across the basin floor, and Rowan went down with it, not buried, not crushed, but pinned at the hip and thigh by a piece of rock that was not negotiable. He could move his arms, he could move his head, he could not move the rest. He heard Cole's footsteps go through the cleft and diminish. He heard the other men follow. Then it was quiet except for the spring, which kept flowing with complete indifference to what had just happened, and the sound of his own breathing, which was ragged in a way he was trying to control and mostly failing. "Rowan!" Eliza's voice somewhere to his right. "Here," he said. She appeared around the edge of the fallen rock, picking her way over the debris with her arms out for balance. She was bleeding from somewhere on her forehead, a cut from the rock or the fall, shallow but steady, and her coat was torn at the shoulder. She looked at the rock on his legs, and he could see her calculating it the same way he had, measuring it against what was physically possible. "I can't lift that," she said. "I know." But she looked around the basin, at the channel, at the arch above. "The water's been moving this rock for a long time. There's a weak line on the left side." She crouched down and looked closer at the junction between the fallen piece and the basin floor. "If I use the short axe from the saddlebag as a lever, Eliza, the compass." She looked toward where he was pointing. The compass was 6 feet away, its chain stretched across the rock. Cole had the documents. If he got the compass too, whatever case could be made from memory and testimony would be that much harder to support. She went for the compass first, which was the right call and the one he would have made. She snatched it up and pressed it into Rowan's outstretched hand, and he closed his fingers around it. Then she went for the axe. It took her 20 minutes to work him free, and they were not a pleasant 20 minutes. The lever principle was sound, but the execution required her to put her full body weight against the axe handle 3 times in sequence, repositioning after each try, and each try moved the rock a small amount that cost her everything she had. She didn't quit. She didn't look at him for reassurance or encouragement. She just worked the problem with the systematic patience of someone who had decided the outcome before she started and was simply executing. When the rock shifted enough for him to drag himself clear, he did it and sat against the basin wall and breathed. His leg hurt from hip to knee in a dull, insistent way that wasn't getting worse, which was the best thing he could say about it. Eliza sat down on the rock across from him. The cut on her head had slowed. She looked at the compass in his hand and the empty space where the tin had been, and then she looked at him. "Cole Maddox," she said. "Cole Maddox." She pushed hair back from her face. "He has the documents." "Yes." "He's going to destroy them." "He's going to try." She was quiet for a moment. The spring kept flowing behind them, indifferent and steady, water running over old stone on its way down to a valley that didn't know it existed yet. "The compass has the markings," she said slowly. "Roy's notebook has his calculations. We were here. We saw the markers your father cut. We know what we found." Rowan looked at her. "It's not the same as the documents," she said, "but it's not nothing either." "No," he said, "it's not nothing." He got to his feet, putting his weight carefully on the bad leg, finding that it held. Not well, but enough. Eliza stood without being asked and positioned herself on his left side without making a performance of it, close enough to be useful if he needed it. They found both horses in the cleft, spooked but intact, tangled in their own reins and extremely unhappy. Getting them turned around in the narrow space took time and patience. By the time they came back through to the snowfield side of the cutoff, the light was going gray and the temperature was dropping fast. Rowan looked at the snowfield, at the mountains, at the darkening sky. His leg was going to be worse tomorrow. Cole Maddox had a significant head start and people waiting for him in the valley below. The documents were gone. "We have to go back," Eliza said. Not a question. We have to go back, he agreed, but not to let it sit. She looked at him. My father built a case up here with 5 years of work, Rowan said. I'm not leaving this mountain to bury it again. He looked down at the compass in his hand. We go back, and we use what we have. The snowfield stretched out ahead of them, white and blank and unforgiving, holding its cold patience the way mountains do. They rode into it. They came down out of the mountains on the third day, moving slower than they'd gone up. Rowan's knee had stiffened overnight into something that made mounting and dismounting a project requiring concentration and controlled breathing. He didn't mention it more than once, and Eliza didn't ask more than once, which was one of the things he was learning about her. She took a person's word for what they said they could manage and adjusted accordingly, without making them feel managed. It was a quality he associated with people who'd had to be practical about pain for a long time. They didn't talk much on the descent. There was a lot to think about, and not much of it was comfortable, and the terrain demanded enough attention that conversation would have been an extra cost neither of them wanted to pay. What they had was this: the compass, Roy Danner's notebook, the knowledge of what they'd seen and where they'd seen it, and Rowan's memory of his father's survey markers cut into the stone columns of the arch. What they didn't have were the documents. What they were riding toward was a valley that had been operating under the Callaway Syndicate's version of reality for 20 years, with a foreman who'd sold his loyalty long ago, now ahead of them, carrying the one piece of evidence that could have made the case simple. Nothing about what came next was going to be simple. On the last stretch of trail before the valley floor opened up, Eliza said, "What's your plan? Specifically?" "Go to town, get in front of people before Cole Maddox and the Callaway operation can get in front of them first." "That's a direction, not a plan." "I know." He shifted his weight off the bad knee, which helped marginally. "I need to talk to Harvey Greer." Harvey Greer was the land office clerk in Caldwell Flats, a thin, precise man who had worked in county records for 30 years and who Rowan had always suspected hated the Callaway Syndicate on a purely professional level, the kind of bureaucratic hatred that came from watching people manipulate records for decades and never being able to do anything about it. "He knows the water allocation history better than anyone. If my father's survey can be corroborated by the original land office records, the ones that existed before the current agreements were drawn up, then the compass and the notebook might be enough to open a formal inquiry." "Might be," Rowan said. He wasn't going to lie to her about the odds. "There's also Thomas Aldridge." Not the Aldridge Ranch shut. A different man, old Thomas, who had been one of the original Valley settlers and had signed the first water agreements under what he'd later told people was duress, though he'd never said it publicly or to anyone with authority. He was 81, and his health was unreliable, and he'd spent 30 years being careful, but Rowan thought that a man who'd been careful for 30 years sometimes reached a point where he was tired of the weight of it. "You think he'll talk?" "I think he might, if he understood that the source exists and can be independently verified. He always claimed the original agreements were coerced. He just never had proof of what the syndicate was hiding." Rowan looked ahead at the valley spreading out below them, the familiar patchwork of homesteads and roads, and the distant glint of the main street's tin roofs in the pale winter sun. "The thing the Callaway people are counting on is that without the documents, nobody believes us. They're thinking Cole gets back ahead of us, tells Preston Callaway we found nothing, and by the time we ride in with a story about a headwater spring and a stone gate, it sounds like the ravings of a man who spent too many nights in the cold. So we don't give them time to set that up." "We don't give them time," Rowan agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "The stone gate," she said. "If the spring is real and the gate is real and the markers are real, then anyone who goes up there can verify it. The documents prove intent, prove the conspiracy. But the spring itself, that's the physical evidence that can't be made to disappear." "That's right. Cole Maddox can burn paper. He can't move a mountain." Rowan looked at her. She was looking at the valley below with an expression that was working something through, some calculation he couldn't quite see the edges of yet. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that if the water flows from that spring, and the spring feeds the channel that runs through the arch, and the arch is above the snowfield, Then somewhere below the snowfield, the water goes somewhere. It joins something, a tributary, a main channel, something the valley depends on. She turned to him. Roy's notebook, the last route entries before his calculations switched to the spring. He was noting a tributary confluence north of the valley. He wrote about it like it was odd, like the flow was larger than it should have been for the season. Because the headwater source was feeding it. Because the headwater source was feeding it, she said, and if there's a way to redirect that flow at the source, if the stone gate is a gate in more than name, if the arch controls or can control where the water goes. Rowan stopped his horse. He thought about the basin, the channel coming through the arch, the way the water spread into the basin and then narrowed again on the far side, moving east along a cut in the rock. The stone gate wasn't just a landmark, it was a junction. The water could be directed. His father had known that. It was in the survey measurements, the output volumes, the channel dimensions. Edmund Mercer hadn't just found the spring. He'd found the mechanism by which the spring's water could be released to flow freely to the valley below, outside of any infrastructure the syndicate controlled. There's a secondary channel, Rowan said, on the east side of the basin. My father measured it. I didn't know what it was for. I thought it was just natural drainage. But if it's been blocked deliberately, Eliza said, a long time ago, before the current agreements, before the syndicate made the valley depend on their infrastructure. She looked at him steadily. Someone blocked that channel to make the valley dependent. Your father found the block. That's what the letters were about. Not just hiding the spring, but hiding what had been done to it. It landed in Rowan's chest like something clicking into place after years of being slightly wrong. His father hadn't just been a surveyor who stumbled onto an inconvenient discovery. He'd been unraveling an act of deliberate sabotage that had been committed before most of the valley's current residents were even there. The water had been diverted. The source had been isolated. The valley had been made helpless by engineering, not by nature. And the Callaway Syndicate had been built on top of that engineered helplessness. The block is stone, Rowan said. Old by the look of the channel, but stone put there by somebody, not formed there. He looked up the trail they'd just come down. If it were removed, the water runs east, Eliza said, down the natural channel, into the valley below the syndicate's infrastructure. Every homestead south and west of the Callaway diversion points gets water. She paused. Without asking permission. They looked at each other on that cold trail with the valley laid out below them and the mountains cold and huge at their backs. And Rowan understood that the plan had just changed shape. Not the confrontation. That still had to happen. But the confrontation would mean something different if the water was already moving when it did. They split just before the valley floor. It wasn't a long conversation. Eliza would go back up. Not all the way to the stone gate. She didn't have time for that. But to the secondary channel where it descended below the snowfield and joined the tributary Roy had noted. If the block was there, at the lower end of the channel, it would be more accessible than the gate itself. Rowan gave her the short axe from his saddlebag and the rest of the hardtack and told her to give herself 3 hours maximum and come back down whether she'd done it or not. If someone's watching the trail, he started, then they're watching you, she said. Not the tributary. Nobody knows about the tributary except us and Roy Danner, and Roy isn't telling anyone. She was right. He didn't like it, but she was right. 3 hours, he said. 3 hours, she agreed. She looked at him for a moment in the way she had, direct, measuring, and then she took the axe and rode back up the trail without anything further, and Rowan turned his horse south toward Caldwell Flats and pushed it as hard as he dared with his bad knee and the remaining miles between him and whatever was waiting. Harvey Greer was at the land office, which was where Harvey Greer always was on a weekday afternoon, surrounded by record books and the smell of old paper and the particular focused unhappiness of a man who cared about accuracy, living in a place that didn't always want it. He looked up when Rowan walked in, and his expression went through several things in quick succession. "You're back," he said. "I need to see the original water survey records," Rowan said. "The pre-agreement ones, Edmund Mercer's survey filings from 15 to 20 years ago." Harvey looked at the door behind Rowan, then at Rowan. "Those records were reviewed and reorganized about 12 years back. Some of the earlier filings the indexing is complicated. Harvey. A pause. Some of them are missing, Harvey said, quiet and precise. Not all, some. The ones that went missing were specifically the upstream surveys from the northwest quadrant. He held Rowan's eyes. I noticed at the time. I made a note of it in my personal records because I didn't know what else to do with it. Another pause, longer. I've been waiting for someone to ask me about it for 12 years. Rowan put the compass and Roy Danner's notebook on Harvey's desk. The headwater spring exists. I've seen it. My father's markers are on the stone columns above it, and the water's been deliberately blocked from reaching the valley. Harvey looked at the notebook. He looked at the compass. He looked at Rowan with the expression of a man who has been keeping a secret so long he's half forgotten it belongs to him. What do you need? Whatever you still have from the original filings, whatever documents survived. And Thomas Aldridge, I need someone to go get Thomas Aldridge and bring him here. He has good days and bad days. I need a good day from him. Whatever's in the record, whatever he can confirm about the original agreements, it needs to be on paper before the Calloway people get organized. Rowan straightened up. Preston Calloway is going to come through that door eventually. I'd like to have as much in order as possible before that happens. Harvey was already moving toward the back files. I'll send my boy for Thomas, he said over his shoulder. Sit down. Your leg looks terrible. It's fine. It's not fine. You're listing to the left. Sit down, Rowan. He sat down. Go on. Preston Calloway arrived not through the land office door, but in the street outside it, which was where Rowan chose to be when the hour got late, and Harvey's boy came back with Thomas Aldridge in a wagon, and word spread the way word spread in small towns, which was fast and without anyone deciding to spread it. By mid-afternoon, there were people in the street. Not a mob, just the organic gathering of people who have heard that something is happening and have come to see what it is. Homesteaders from the South Parcels, the proprietors of several businesses. Earl Pickett in his eternal apron. People who had been paying the syndicate's water rates for a decade and a half and had developed opinions about it that they mostly kept quiet because keeping quiet was how you kept your water. Thomas Aldridge sat in the back of the wagon with a blanket over his knees, looking simultaneously very old and more alert than Rowan had expected. He had listened to Rowan's account in Harvey's office with his eyes half closed and his hands flat on the table. And when Rowan finished, he had said, in a voice like wind through dry grass, I signed those agreements under threat of having my diversion cut entirely. I have said so before and said it to no one who could do anything. I will say it again now to whoever needs to hear it. And that was enough. That was, in the arithmetic of what they had, enough. Preston Calloway came out of the hotel with 2 men behind him and found Rowan in the middle of the main street with Harvey Greer's surviving records spread on the top of a barrel, and Thomas Aldridge 3 feet away in his wagon and approximately 40 people watching. Preston took the scene in with one sweep of his eyes, and his expression did something controlled and professional. Closing off, recalculating, finding the version of itself that could still manage this. Rowan, he said. Pleasant, even now. The man was remarkable in his consistency. What is this? This is Thomas Aldridge testifying that his signature on the original water agreements was obtained under coercion, Rowan said, loud enough to carry. This is Harvey Greer confirming that the upstream survey records specifically covering the northwest quadrant were removed from the land office files 12 years ago. This is a surveyor's compass belonging to my father with his location markings intact, corroborated by a field notebook kept by Roy Danner over 5 years. And this? He held up the compass, turning it so the people around him could see it, though they couldn't see the markings from where they stood, is what Edmund Mercer found before he was killed for finding it. Killed. He said it plain in daylight, in front of people who had believed for 5 years that it was an accident, and the word moved through the crowd the way words move when they've been true for a long time and everyone knew it and nobody had said it. Preston's pleasant expression cracked at one corner. Just one corner, just briefly. You're making accusations you can't support with a compass and an old man's memory. I'm making observations, Rowan said. The accusations will follow when the territorial court reviews what's left of the records and sends someone to verify the headwater spring. He looked at Preston directly. Which they will, because Harvey Greer is filing a formal report today. On what grounds? Fraudulent water rights allocation, destruction of public land records, And the question of my father's death. Rowan didn't look away. Cole Maddox is going to be a problem for you, Preston. Whatever he told you when he came back last night, whatever he's told you over 5 years, he's a man who knows what was done and did it anyway, and men like that are only reliable until they're not. Preston said nothing. That silence told Rowan something. Where is he? Rowan said. He came back down ahead of me. He should have been here last night. Still nothing, but Preston's two men exchanged a look that wasn't quick enough. Cole Maddox had not come back, or had come back and not gone to Preston, or had gone somewhere else entirely with the documents and whatever remained of his conscience after 5 years of expensive compromise. Rowan filed that uncertainty away to deal with later and turned back to the crowd, because the crowd was what mattered right now. Every homesteader in this valley who's been paying the syndicate's water rate, he said, has been paying for access to water that was never legitimately theirs to sell. The source belongs to the land. The land records will show it, once the ones that were removed are accounted for. He looked around at the faces, tired, cautious, some angry in the way that people were angry when they'd been right about something for years and hadn't been able to prove it. My father died trying to bring this back. I'm bringing back what I can. The rest is going to require a court and time, and people willing to stand up and say what they know. Thomas Aldridge said from his wagon, in his dry old voice, I'll stand up. Earl Pickett said from the sidewalk, I've got records of every water rate I paid for 14 years. Everyone. Two homesteaders from the South Parcels said things at once that overlapped into something general but unmistakable in its direction. Preston Calloway stood in the street looking at what was happening and doing the calculation that a man in his position does, measuring what could still be controlled against what had already gotten away. It was not, by the look of him, a favorable calculation. What happened next had a quality of chaos that nobody fully controlled. Preston turned to go back into the hotel, and two homesteaders moved to block the door, not violently, just with their bodies and the basic human fact of being larger and more numerous than him and no longer afraid. One of his men reached for something at his belt, and 3 other men moved simultaneously, and the reaching stopped. Somebody was shouting about the land office records. Somebody else was asking where the territorial judge was and getting 3 different wrong answers. And then, from the north end of the street, someone shouted. Not words at first, just a shout of surprise, and then other people turned to look north, and then the words clarified themselves through the noise. Water. Water in the Hendricks tributary. Someone said they'd seen it from the Ridge Road. The north tributary was running higher and clearer than it had in years, running strong, running like... Rowan turned north. He couldn't see the tributary from where he stood, but he could see the Ridge Road in the distance, and on it a rider coming down at a pace that was fast but controlled, navigating the winter road with the particular care of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. Eliza Wren. 3 hours, as agreed. The cut on her forehead had dried and darkened, and her coat was filthy at the knees from where she'd clearly worked on her hands and knees at something. She rode into the street and pulled up beside Rowan and looked at the scene. Preston Calloway against a hotel door, Harvey Greer's records on a barrel, 40 people in various states of motion, with the steady, unperturbed expression of someone who had expected this and was not surprised. The channel block is gone, she said. Not loudly, just to Rowan. It'll take a day for the flow to stabilize, but the water's moving east. The tributary. Running clear, she said. It'll reach the lower homesteads by tomorrow morning. Rowan looked at the compass in his hand. He thought about his father standing at that stone arch with his survey tools and his knowledge of what he'd found, and the complete certainty that it mattered, that it would matter if someone could just get the information back to the valley below. He had gotten it back. Not cleanly, not without cost, not in the form his father had carefully prepared. But it was back, and the water was moving, and the valley below that had been managed and controlled and bled slow for 20 years, was about to wake up to a tributary running full on a November morning with no explanation the syndicate could provide. Preston Calloway saw Eliza's face and understood something from it that he couldn't have put into words in that moment. His expression did the final thing it was going to do in public. It stopped calculating and just went tired. It's done, Rowan said to him. quiet enough that only the people close by could hear. Whatever Cole took from the mountain, whatever you do with it, the spring exists. People have seen the tributary. The land records are filed. Thomas Aldridge has given his testimony. He put the compass in his coat pocket. It's done. Preston Calloway looked at him for a long moment, with the look of a man watching something fall that he's been propping up for a very long time. Then he said nothing and turned, and the crowd let him through because sometimes letting a man walk away is the end of the story, and fighting about it just extends something that's already finished. Rowan stood in the street while the noise around him continued, voices overlapping, questions forming, the particular human sound of a community processing a shift in what was true. His knee ached badly. He was exhausted in a way that went past tired into something structural, like the exhaustion lived in his bones rather than his muscles. Eliza climbed down from her horse and stood beside him. She was looking at the north end of the street, at the direction of the tributary she couldn't see from here but knew was running. She looked like a woman who had done a hard thing and was checking the feeling of having done it, deciding whether it was what she'd expected. "Your father's markers," she said. "On the arch. They'll still be there when the court sends someone." "Yes." "Then it holds," she said. "Whatever Cole Maddox does with those documents, it holds." Rowan looked at her. She had blood on her face and dirt on her coat, and she was standing in the middle of a street in a town that didn't entirely know who she was yet. And she said it holds the way she said everything, steady and plain, without needing it to be more than it was. "Yes," he said, "it holds." Cole Maddox turned himself in on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the confrontation in the street. He rode into Caldwell Flats alone, without anyone coming to get him, and tied his horse in front of Harvey Greer's land office and sat down on the step and waited. He had the tin case with him. Edmund Mercer's documents were inside it, intact, every page. He had not burned them. He had apparently ridden north after coming down from the mountain, gotten 2 days away, and then stopped somewhere on the trail and sat with what he was carrying and made a decision that had taken him 11 days to finish making. Rowan heard about it from Thomas Bear, who heard it from Silas, who had been in town buying feed when Cole arrived. By the time Rowan got there, Harvey had already taken custody of the tin, and a territorial deputy who had arrived 3 days prior was in the process of taking Cole's statement in the back room. Rowan stood outside the land office for a moment. Then he went in. Cole was sitting across a table from the deputy, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim the way men do when they need something to do with their hands. He looked older than he had on the mountain, not from the 11 days specifically, from the weight of longer years finally settling on his face at once, the way things sometimes waited until you stopped holding them up. He looked up when Rowan came in. The deputy looked at Rowan and then at Cole, and Cole said, "It's all right, let him stay." The deputy had opinions about that, but no strong objection, and he stepped out to give them a minute that wasn't exactly privacy, but was the closest available. Cole and Rowan looked at each other across the table. "You didn't burn them," Rowan said. "No." "You thought about it." "I thought about it for about 2 days," Cole said. "Out on the North Road in the cold, thinking about it." He set the hat down on the table. "And I kept thinking about your father, the way he'd talk about that high country, the way he talked about water like it mattered, the way things matter when you've thought hard about them and not just used them." He stopped. "I couldn't burn his work. I couldn't do it. I did enough to him already." Rowan sat down across from him. His knee was still wrong. The doctor had told him to stay off it for 2 weeks, which he had interpreted as 2 days, which the doctor had not been pleased about. He put his weight on the good leg and looked at the man who had been the closest thing to a fixture of his childhood and tried to locate what he felt about him. It wasn't clean. It wasn't simple. That was the honest answer. "Did you know they were going to kill him?" Rowan said. "Before, not after." Cole was quiet for a long time. "I knew they were going to stop him," he said finally. "I knew it was going to be permanent. I told myself I didn't know what that meant." He looked at his hands. "That was a lie I told myself because the truth was too heavy to carry with the rest of it." "It's still too heavy." "Yes," Cole said. "It will be." There was nothing else Rowan needed from that conversation. He stood up, which took more effort than he wanted Cole to see, and he stood in the doorway for a moment. "The documents," he said. The territorial court, they'll need your testimony about the syndicate's involvement, the names. I know, Cole said. That's why I came back. He picked the hat up again and turned it once. It won't fix what I did, but it's what I can do now. Rowan left him there and stepped back into the November air and stood on the step where Cole had been sitting and looked down the main street of Caldwell Flats. The mountain was visible from here on clear days, gray-blue and indifferent, keeping its secrets and its water and the marks his father had cut into its stone columns. It would be there when the court came. It would be there after. He thought about his father and the way he'd been allowing himself to think about him lately. Not just as absence, not just as loss, but as a person who had been specific and difficult and relentless about things that mattered to him, and who had been right about this particular thing so completely that he died for it. Edmund Mercer had not been a man who was easy to know. He'd been demanding and sometimes distant, and he'd spent more time in the high country than was strictly necessary for any practical purpose. But he'd understood that the land and the water were the actual foundation of everything, and that foundations mattered, and that someone had to care enough to get it right. Rowan thought that he probably understood that now, in a way, he hadn't at 29. Net. The territorial court sent 2 men in December, just before the first deep freeze locked the high passes. They made the trip to the Stone Gate with Rowan and a county surveyor named Adler, who was thorough in the satisfying way of people who take their work personally. Adler spent 2 days at the spring and the arch, measuring and documenting and making notations in a clean, systematic hand that bore no resemblance to the urgent, compressed marks Edmund Mercer had left. But he confirmed everything. The spring was real, the output volumes were substantial, the secondary channel block had been recently removed, and the stone columns bore survey markers consistent with Edmund Mercer's known methods and documented in the style of his period. Cole Maddox's testimony named names. The original documents named more. Harvey Greer's surviving records filled the gaps in between. The territorial court convened a formal hearing in February, and the Callaway water allocation agreements were suspended pending review, which was the legal language for what ordinary people in the valley understood as the syndicate's grip on the water was broken. Preston Callaway hired 3 lawyers from the Capitol and contested everything with the energy of a man who had a great deal to lose and knew it. He was not wrong that the process would be slow, or that slow processes had their own kind of cost, or that money and legal expertise could drag things out well past the point where ordinary people ran out of patience. He was right about all of that in the short term. What he had not accounted for was the tributary. By December, the North Tributary was running full and clear, and the homesteads south and west of the old diversion infrastructure had water they hadn't needed to purchase or petition for. Not in massive quantities, Mom. The spring was substantial, but not miraculous. It was water, not a solution to every problem, but enough. Enough to cut the dependency. Enough to give people the experience of one winter without paying the syndicate's rate, which turned out to be a more powerful argument than any legal document, because it was the argument you could drink. By spring, the valley had reorganized around the new reality in the particular way that communities reorganize when the thing that's been holding them in a specific shape is removed. Not perfectly. There was dispute about the tributary's management, who had access to what flow, how to divide something fairly that had never been divided fairly before. There were arguments and some grudges, and 2 fistfights that Rowan heard about secondhand and tried not to have opinions about. People did not become instantly good or reasonable when their material circumstances improved. That was not how people worked, and anyone who expected it had not been paying attention. But the homestead stayed. The families that had been one bad water season away from walking away from their land stayed. That was the thing that mattered, and Rowan understood it as the thing that mattered, without requiring it to be more than it was. The widows came one more time. Not all of them, and not in the way they'd come before. Clara Voss came in March, which was the right time of year for Clara. She had a farmer's sense of when the ground was ready for something. She came alone, and she sat across from Rowan at his kitchen table and drank coffee that he had by then learned to make at a reasonable standard, and she looked at him for a while. "I owe you an honest conversation," she said. "You don't owe me anything, Clara." "I do." I came to you 2 years ago with a practical proposal, and I dressed it up in sensible language, but the truth was, I wanted the water rights and the land position, and you seemed like someone I could manage, which was a stupid thing to think about a man like you. She said it bluntly, in the Clara Voss way that he'd always appreciated even when he didn't like what she was saying. I also spread things about that girl that were unkind and not based on anything solid. Her name is Eliza. I know her name. Clara wrapped her hands around her cup. She did something I wouldn't have done. I want to say that plainly. I would have taken that compass and weighed my options with it. She returned it because it wasn't hers. That's a different kind of person than I am. Rowan didn't argue with that assessment. She's a different kind of person than most people, he said. Clara looked at him with the expression of a woman who has arrived at something she's been approaching for a while. You're going to ask her? It wasn't quite a question. Yes, he said. Good. Clara finished her coffee and stood up. Don't take too long about it. That's practical advice, not sentimental. A woman who's done what she's done and hasn't said anything about what she expects in return, that kind of patience has a limit. Not because she's impatient, because she'll convince herself it's not going to happen and make other plans, and by the time you get around to asking, she'll have talked herself out of needing it. Rowan thought that was probably the most useful thing Clara Voss had ever said to him. He told her so, and she made a sound that was almost a laugh, and went out to her horse, and that was the last time she came to talk about anything personal. But he asked Eliza on a Saturday in April, which was not a particularly romantic time or place. She was at the dock behind Pickett's store, at the end of a workday. And he had ridden over with no stated reason, and she had looked at him arriving and waited without saying anything while he dismounted badly because the knee was mostly healed, but not entirely. I have something to say, he said. All right. I'm not good at saying things directly when the thing is personal. I've noticed that. I know. I'm saying it so you understand what comes next might not be as clear as it should be. He looked at her. She had her hair pulled back plain, same as always, and she was looking at him with the steady gray eyes that he had come to understand were her natural state. Not guarded, just clear. The kind of eyes that saw what was in front of them without adding to it or subtracting from it. I'd like you to come to the Mercer Ranch. Not to work, to stay. He paused. With me. As, I'd like you to be my wife, Eliza. If that's something you'd want. She was quiet for a moment. Is that the clearest version of that? She said. Yes? All right. She seemed to be considering something. Can I ask you something first? Yes. Is this because you feel you owe me something? Because of the compass or the mountain or the channel? No, he said. It came out more immediate than most things came out of him, with less space before it. No, it's because you're the first person I've wanted to come home to in a long time, and I don't think that's a debt. I think that's something else. She looked at him for another moment, not performing the considering, actually considering, which was different, and which he appreciated because a quick answer from her would have felt like the wrong answer somehow. She thought about things honestly and said what she concluded, and he had learned to trust the gap between her question and her answer. Yes, she said. That's something I'd want. They stood on the dock in the April evening with the first real warmth of the year coming off the boards, and the smell of new mud and the sound of the valley settling into a different kind of season, and it was not a perfect moment. His knee hurt. She still had the scar from the cut on her forehead, healed to a thin line above her left eye. Neither of them were people things came easily to, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But the thing he'd said was true. He wanted to come home to her. And she'd said yes in the way she said things, plainly and having thought about it, and that was enough to build on. That was, in his experience, more than most people managed to get to. They married in June, small and plain, with Thomas Baer and Silas as witnesses, and Harvey Greer signing the documents with the careful penmanship of a man who took record-keeping seriously, even in personal matters. Earl Pickett came without being asked, which was the most socially spontaneous thing Rowan had ever seen him do, and he brought a bottle of something decent that was consumed on the porch of the Mercer Ranch afterward, while the evening came in slow and warm over the valley. The ranch changed in the months after that, though change was not the right word for something that happened gradually and without announcement. Eliza was methodical in the way she came into a space. She didn't rearrange things dramatically or make declarations about how things should be. She just noticed what needed doing and did it, and over time what needed doing turned out to include things Rowan hadn't recognized as needs. The porch got fixed that summer. She did it herself over 3 days, correctly diagnosing that the lean was a foundation issue and addressing the foundation rather than the surface, which was characteristic of her in ways that extended beyond carpentry. She kept working at pickets through the summer, which Rowan didn't object to because objecting would have been both useless and wrong. She was good at the work, and she wasn't going to stop being good at it because her circumstances had changed. In the fall, when the territorial court's review of the water rights began generating paperwork that Harvey Greer needed help managing, she started spending time at the land office instead, which suited her better than freight sorting had suited her, and which Harvey received as the specific gift it was. The ranch itself. Rowan had been thinking about it since the spring, about what his father had said years ago, long before the surveys and the compass and all of it, about land being something you held in trust rather than something you owned outright. That the Mercer parcel had water when others didn't had never sat entirely right with Rowan, even before he understood why it was the case. After the tributary was running and the court proceedings were underway, he began talking to some of the families who'd been hardest pressed in the bad years, the ones who'd stayed when they could have left, who'd bent when the syndicate squeezed and hadn't quite broken, families who had children and no backup plan and very little margin for anything going wrong. He parceled off the south section of the Mercer land, not sold, not given away in a way that created obligation, but made available on terms that were the opposite of the syndicate's terms. Fair terms. Long terms. Terms that assumed the people taking them were capable of managing their own situation if given access to the basic resources they'd been systematically denied. He wasn't doing anyone a favor, he told himself. He was correcting for something that should never have been the way it was. Eliza said, when he told her what he was planning, "That's most of the south section." "Yes." "That's a significant loss of acreage." "I know." She was quiet for a moment, working through it, and then, "What do you need from me to make the numbers work on what we keep?" Which was, he thought, the right question. Not whether to do it, but how to do it in a way that was actually viable, rather than a gesture that would collapse in 2 years and help nobody. That was Eliza's quality in its most essential form. She didn't deal in gestures. She dealt in what was real and what would hold. They worked the numbers together at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, and the thing they arrived at was tight but manageable, which was the same thing the Valley was arriving at on a larger scale, something that required more from everyone but demanded it equally rather than demanding it only from the people who had the least. The compass stayed on the mantel above the fireplace, which was where Rowan had put it the night they came back from the mountain and where it had stayed since. Eliza had asked him once, early on, if he thought about selling it or putting it away somewhere, and he'd said no, and she'd said fine, and that had been the end of the conversation. What it meant now was different from what it had meant for 5 years. For 5 years, it had meant loss, the thing that was gone, the thread back to his father that had been cut and couldn't be reattached. When Eliza had put it in his hand that November afternoon, cold and heavy and real, what it had felt like was restoration. Like something that had been out of alignment had moved back to where it belonged. But that wasn't quite right either. His father was still gone. The 5 years were still 5 years. Nothing about the compass actually repaired what had happened. It was a piece of metal with markings on it that had been useful and was now a record of something that mattered. That was what it was. What Rowan had come to think about it, sitting on the fixed porch in the evenings while the valley settled into its new and imperfect version of itself, was that some things don't get repaired. They get carried forward. His father had found something true and had died for it, and the truth had survived, not because some larger force was protecting it, but because several ordinary people had made the particular choice, at the particular moment when it cost them something, to not let it disappear. Roy Danner had kept the compass for 5 years in the bottom of a trunk when it would have been safer and easier to throw it in a river. Eliza had carried it back because it wasn't hers to keep. Harvey Greer had made a note in his personal records about the missing files because he hadn't known what else to do with what he knew. Thomas Aldridge had spent 30 years waiting for someone to ask him the right question. None of them were heroes in the way that stories like to make heroes, clean and purposeful and moving directly toward a good conclusion. They were people who had held on to something that mattered in the ungainly, imperfect way that people held on to things, with doubt and delay and the ordinary friction of difficult circumstances. And the thing had survived anyway. That seemed to Rowan like the most honest version of how anything good survived. Eliza found him on the porch one evening in late October, the anniversary of nothing in particular, the kind of evening that had no significance except that it was October, and the mountains were blue-gray in the last light, and the valley below was the same valley it had always been and also different. She sat down beside him in the other chair, the one that had been there since before her and that had always seemed like it was waiting for something. She had a cup of coffee and she handed him one without asking. They sat in the quiet for a while, which was something they were both good at. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who don't need to fill space with sound to make it feel inhabited. After a while, she said, "Thomas Aldridge died this morning." "I heard." He'd heard an hour ago from Thomas Bear. He made it to the hearing. He got to say it on the record. He did. That matters. Yes. She turned the cup in her hands. He told me once, back in the fall, when I was helping Harvey with the filings, he said the worst part of the whole business wasn't the fear. It was having something true to say and nobody who could hear it properly. She looked out at the mountains. He said the hearing was the first time he'd felt like himself in 30 years. Rowan thought about that, about what it cost a person to carry the truth for 30 years without a place to put it down, about how much of what people called cowardice was actually the exhausting, grinding experience of being right about something in a situation where being right didn't help you and might actually hurt you. He didn't think he'd been a particularly brave person in any of this. He'd been a person who'd had enough anger and enough loss to push him past the point where caution was more comfortable than action. That was different from courage. He'd seen real courage in Roy Danner holding on to something for 5 years with no guarantee it would ever reach the right hands, and Thomas Aldridge saying it on the record at 81 with nothing left to lose and also nothing left to prove. And Eliza working a lever against a rock in a cold mountain basin with her whole body weight because stopping wasn't something she was built to do. "The valley's going to be all right," Eliza said. Not sentimentally, like she was stating a conclusion she'd arrived at from evidence. "Yes," Rowan said. "Not perfect." "No, not perfect." She almost smiled. "But all right." The light went, the way it did in October, quickly, without ceremony, the mountains going dark and the sky holding a little color for a while, and then letting that go too. The compass was inside on the mantel. The porch was level. The water in the north tributary was running clean into a valley that knew now where it came from. Edmund Mercer had carried that compass for 30 years and marked it with what he knew and trusted it to find its way to where it needed to go. It had taken 5 years, and a woman who understood that some things didn't belong to you just because they'd ended up in your hands. But it had gotten there. That was the thing about truth that Rowan had come to believe. Sitting on his level porch in the October dark, with his wife beside him, and the valley below, and the mountains above, holding whatever they still kept. Truth didn't move fast, and it didn't move clean, and it needed people to carry it, ordinary people with their ordinary fears and their occasional failures and their stubborn refusal, at the decisive moment, to let the right thing disappear. It needed someone to carry it. That was all. Just someone who would.